Thank you for loving me for who I am. Christ lived the life that I couldn't live. He died the death that I should have died. He paid the debt, though it wasn't his. Now the dead in Christ, I said, will one day rise.
Hello and welcome to our first study in the book of Romans. Now, why would we study this book? You see, if the Bible was like a mansion, where each book of the Bible was a different room in that mansion, I would submit to you that the book of Romans is like the master bedroom. Each room is important and valuable, but some rooms just let in more light. Some rooms are just more wonderful. Some rooms you just want to spend more time in. I'd submit to you that that's what the book of Romans is. It's the master bedroom of the mansion of the Bible. What's so great about the book of Romans is throughout history, God has used this book of Romans to impact and change many lives, including my own. When I was finishing uni, God used the book of Romans to transform my life and save my soul. Actually, probably in my first year of uni, I was invited to a church where someone was preaching through the book of Romans. And God used the message of that book to show me my sin, to help me to see my sinfulness and to turn to Christ in faith. This book is very special to me personally. Now, if you were trapped on a desert island and you could only take one book of the Bible with you, what book would you take? For some people, it might be John's Gospel. That's the most popular out of the Gospels. It might be something really foundational like the book of Genesis. For me, it would be the book of Romans. There's just so much in this book that will blow you away, that will transform the way you think about God and God's world. And so much in this book that will make you fall more in love with Jesus and will have you captivated by the gospel. Throughout history, God's used this book to impact several extremely significant figures throughout church history. The first would be the early church father Augustine. He had a Bible with him and he was walking and he heard a child singing, "Take up and read." So he opened the Bible and read. And he read a section from the book of Romans, I believe Romans chapter 13. And God used that to transform him and change his life. And he is in fact probably the most significant figure from early church history. The second important figure who was transformed by the book of Romans was Martin Luther. Martin Luther recognized that man is justified by faith apart from works of the law through studying the book of Romans. And through Martin Luther, God began a reformation that transformed the world. The book of Romans has been extremely important. An example that's a little bit more modern, although probably before most of my students were born, but there was a famous preacher in London in the 50s and 60s named Martin Lloyd-Jones. And he was running a Friday night Bible study. I don't know what you do on Friday nights, but you might imagine, it must be hard to build a Bible study on a Friday night when everyone wants to be hanging out with friends and things. But Martin Lloyd-Jones was such a famous preacher that this Friday night Bible study was packed. People loved coming along. And the most famous series he did during these Friday night Bible studies was a series in the book of Romans. Now, this book is so rich. There's so much in this book that Martin Lloyd-Jones ended up preaching 372 sermons in the book of Romans across 11 years. That's pretty amazing. So buckle in. We've got a long journey ahead of us. I'm kidding. We're only going to spend one term in this book. However, what that means is there's going to be many things we're not going to be able to dive into. We're going to skate across the top. We'll get some depth. We'll get a good overview of the book, but we won't be able to touch on everything. So what I want to do is I want to give a bit of background to the book of Romans, and then I want us to consider the structure of the book. So first things first, author. Very quickly, it's a letter obviously written by the Apostle Paul. We learn about Paul in the book of Acts. We learn about his conversion from a Pharisee to a Christian. Jesus meets him on the road to Damascus, and Paul had been going about persecuting Christians, seeing them thrown in jail and killed for their faith. But then Jesus met Paul and transformed his life and sent him out as an apostle. Now, one of the reasons why this fact is significant is because what this means is that the apostle Paul is a recovering Pharisee. He's someone who tried to earn righteousness before God by working hard, by following laws, but he wasn't able to. And what this means is that Paul is like the perfect guy to write the book on justification by faith alone. So Paul was once a Pharisee who's now a Christian. He was someone who tried to earn his way to heaven, but now he's the one who writes the book on justification by faith alone. In terms of date, so this letter was written either in Corinth or Greece during Paul's third missionary journey. And this puts the date in the late 50s, so around 56 to 57 AD. The audience was was obviously the church in Rome, which would have been a mixture of Jewish Christians and Greek Gentile Christians. So a combination of the two. Some Jews would become Christians, and probably predominantly Greeks who had heard the message of Jesus and had trusted in him. Now, what I want us to do is, over the term, we're going to be diving into the book of Romans and looking at one piece at a time, and that's kind of going to be our microscope view of the book of Romans. We're going to look at individual verses and passages and work our way through the book that way. But what's also important is to have a macro view of the book of Romans. It's important to be able to understand the letter as a whole and see how the different parts fit together. So what I want to do now is I want to outline the structure of the book of Romans so that as we work through, you can remember where we are and how this fits into the bigger picture of what's going on in Romans. So the structure is actually really helpful and really quite logical, which is awesome. Part 1 spans from chapter 1, verses 1 to verse 17 of chapter 1. And I've titled that Paul's Thesis. This is his main idea outlined in these first 17 verses of the book. And it's all about the good news, the gospel of God, as he calls it, the good news of God. What is that good news? That good news is that we are saved by faith alone. We are made right before God by faith apart from any works of the law. It's faith that makes us right with God and not our works. That's Paul's thesis, and he outlines that in some detail in the first 17 verses of the book of Romans. Part 2 spans from chapter 1 verse 18 all the way through to chapter 5 verse 21. And I've titled this Paul's Case for Justification by Faith Alone. This is Paul's argument where he makes the case that man is justified by faith apart from works of the law. And I've broken this down into two further parts. So the first part of Paul's argument is that we're all sinful. And this is from 118 to 320. We are all sinful. Now as we hear that, we go, yep, I agree, we're all sinful. But what Paul does in this section is he elaborates on that point, he belabors the point, and he shows us with vivid detail that before God, we stand absolutely helplessly condemned. One of the problems that Paul needs to address is the problem of our sinfulness. He needs to show us that we are sinful. If he's going to make the argument that we're justified by faith alone, he needs to show us that there's no way that we can be justified by our works because of how sinful we are. One of the reasons we think that our works can justify us is because we think we're just this close to heaven. We just need to do a little bit more and we'll reach heaven. What Paul shows us is that, in fact, we are extremely sinful. Every aspect of our lives is affected by sin, and everything in us is opposed to God. We're entirely alienated from God, and by nature we're God's enemy. And Paul cuts off every possible avenue that we might run to in order to try and justify ourselves by our own works. So in that section, he's shown that we are all incredibly sinful. We only spend a bit of time there, and you're going to really feel the weight of your sinfulness in a new way, I believe. after establishing that point, Paul then argues that God justifies us by faith apart from any works of the law. And that's from 3:21 all the way through to 5:21. That's Paul's argument that we are made right by God by faith apart from works of the law. Why? Why faith apart from works of the law? Because through faith, the righteousness of God is made known. We can have an alien righteousness, a righteousness that doesn't come from us, but a righteousness that comes from Jesus and that is given to us. And this all happens through Jesus' sacrifice, Jesus' propitiation, where he absorbs the wrath of God and takes away God's anger, and then gives to us his righteousness. And we're going to explore that in vivid detail. And it's in that we really see the beauty and glory of the Lord Jesus Christ. Part 3, I've titled Paul Answers Objections to Justification by Faith Alone. And this spans from chapter 6, verse 1, all the way to chapter 11, verse 36. Now, this is Paul answering objections to his thesis that we're justified by faith alone. I've kind of broken that down into 4 main objections that come up. And just as we get there, have a think. How are you going at responding to objections to the gospel? Are you able to respond to objections that people make to the gospel? A lot of us are familiar with kind of objections to Christianity. Oh, did Jesus really die and rise again? Oh, what about evolution? Oh, can I trust the Bible? What about objections to the gospel message? As Paul lays out his argument, there are a number of objections that come up. The first one is, does this mean I can live however I want? If Paul is saying that we're justified by faith and our works don't come into consideration in terms of our justification, Paul is saying, one of the objections that comes against Paul is, what does that mean? I can just live however I want then? How would you respond to that? Paul helps us to think through that. He lays out a good and biblical response to that objection. The second objection is, what does this mean about the role of God's law? If we're justified by faith, then what's the purpose of God's law? If we don't have to keep it to be justified, why does it exist? What is the purpose of the law? And that's from chapter 7, verses 1 to 25. The third objection is this salvation certain? Can I lose this salvation? From chapter 8, verse 1 to verse 39 of chapter 8, Paul addresses that objection. And then the fourth objection, what about the nation of Israel? Now you might think, what does the nation of Israel have to do with any of this? As we follow the argument and we see the relationship that Israel has had with God throughout the Old Testament, it's going to be important that we're able to respond to this objection. The objection is saying, God made all these promises to Israel, but how come so many of them aren't believing? How come so many of them aren't trusting in Jesus? Do God's promises still apply to Israel? And what we're going to see is that the answer is yes, they do, but Israel isn't just the descendants of Abraham. That's not the real Israel. The real Israel are those who are trusting in Jesus. So that's the fourth objection. Part 4, I've titled Exhortation and Application. And this spans from chapter 12, verse 1, all the way through to chapter 15, verse 13. Now, exhortation and application, because this is Paul's encouragement for how we should live in light of everything that's come before. The previous 11 chapters outlined the gospel message and addressed all the objections. And now the question is, how should we live in light of this? So part A, what is spiritual living? What does it mean to set your life aside as a sacrifice to God? How is this an act of spiritual worship, and what does that look like? B, how do we relate to the authorities around us? What is owed of us to them? And then C, how do we relate to other believers without judging one another in an unhelpful way? Finally, part 5 is Paul's personal matters and final greeting. And that is from chapter 15, verse 14, through to the end of the book, chapter 16, verse 27. So that's our macro view of the book of Romans. That's where we're heading across this term, looking at the individual parts of that breakdown. I look forward next time to looking at Paul's thesis and seeing his outline, his introduction to the book of Romans. I'll see you then.
Thank you for loving me for who I am. Christ lived the life that I couldn't live. He died the death that I should have died. He paid the debt, though it wasn't his. Now the dead in Christ, I said, well, one day rise.